what if I could show you a way where, you could trade the residential, the remunerative property for two additional property instead of just holding that one, because it would be a no-brainer, even if it was a lower capital gain. So this is what this is actually going to dive into. So most of the experienced investors that come to us, right, they always have a spreadsheet. I start the conversation by saying, hey, look, send me your spreadsheet and we can have a look at what we can do. And they always have some sort of spreadsheet here like this, sort of outlining, what their rental incomes are, how much they purchased it for, how much debt they have. And as you can see, this is like someone who's more experienced. They built up a $7.5 million portfolio. They still got 3.3 million in mortgages, and they got annual rental income of 250K. Now that looks like a huge figure, but when you think about, when you consider all of the expenses, Mr. and Mrs. Lee don't actually have that much cash flow remaining, okay? And they also have this equity that's available, 2.7 million, that they can't actually access. It's not really doing much work. Even though the bank would lend it to them, this is of course accounting for 80%. This is based on using a non-bank lender. But even at 60%, we still have more than $1 million of available equity that we can't use. So how much can Mr. and Mrs. Lee borrow even though they have this much equity? Okay, so this is a typical scenario of a borrowing calculation. Okay, so you got two applicants, you've got your fixed commitment. This is actually going to be a huge factor going forward with the servicing calculation. Actually, all the banks have started implementing new rules under the new triple CFA regime. Basically, it's just to make sure responsible lending. That's basically the summary of it. Being responsible to our clients, really deep diving into the expenses instead of just using like a average figure. They're going to really look into your bank statement and understand what you're spending, your outgoings are. So it's really important that you try to keep track of things. And if you're spending the less regular commitments you have, the better it is for your servicing calculation. Say for example, like even childcare expense, for example, if you guys are listening, and childcare expense is a huge one. And if you could say grandma's paying for it and it's not coming out of your account, it actually increases your borrowing capacity quite a bit. Okay. And so you have income to factor in, like 110,000, 55,000 here. You've got the rental income of 4,800. And then the third most important thing is the rental, the mortgage, right? And this is where the biggest discrepancy is, because when people calculate their own calculation, they're like, okay, well, I'm only paying 3%. I'm actually cash flow positive. The bank should lend me more money. But the bank is actually going to stress test this at a much higher interest rate, because they don't think interest rates always going to stay this low. So they're going to stress test this closer to 6%. And now actually when we factor everything in, there isn't any money left over, and Mr. and Mrs. Lee can't actually borrow more money. Okay. So how can we change this position, right? Because you've got all of this equity, 2.7 if we use the non-bank, 1.3 if we use the main bank. How could we change? How could we access this? How could we get most return from this? Because if you got 2.7 mil, you can actually buy up to 13 mil of properties, 9 to 13 mil quite easily. This is what we call lazy capital, right? It's not doing the work it should. It's not giving the cash flow that Mr. and Mrs. Lee deserve. Okay, so here's a second hack with the commercial, right? Okay, if a residential property, you're getting $950 in rents, what happens is the bank's going to use 75% of this to service the loan. So that means the net usable income to service a loan is 712, okay? Whereas if it's a commercial property of $950 rents coming in, the bank is actually willing to use up to 95%. So that means for servicing, you've got an extra $200 in servicing income. That's actually equates to around $200,000, just under 100. Yeah, about just around $200,000 extra in borrowing. So that means if you could use residential equity to buy commercial, you actually end up with more servicing power. Okay, so equivalent to if you've got $950 in rent in commercial, it's equivalent to buying a residential property of $1,200 in rental income, which is great for servicing. Okay, in simpler terms, 5% net in commercial is going to be the same as buying like a residential on 6.33 gross yield on the residential. Okay. So what if Mrs. Lee and Mr. and Mrs. Lee swap a property for commercial with 5% yield? So let's see what the implication looks like if we just added one commercial property into Mr. and Mrs. Lee's situation. So we've got a low performing asset here. You know, maybe it's a land bank, maybe it's something that they just it's got a bit of land, but you know, they're just not willing to develop it because they're getting old, and you know, they'd rather not take that risk and pass it on to someone else. They could sell it, swap it for something else. That might be something they might prefer. And a lot of the time, it is the truth for a lot of people. They shouldn't be trying to go in and do like a 7-lot development. It's not as easy as what people think, right? So we've got this low performing asset here. It's only yielding 2.9%. And so what if we could swap this for a residential property of 6.3, like 5% yield, which is a gross yield of 6.33. Now our rental income actually have increased from 4,870 down here up to 6,151. So basically we swapped 2 million for 2 million of commercial properties. So what does that do to Mr. and Mrs. Lee's borrowing capacity? Okay, it actually increases it by a significant amount to 750,000, right? And this is even before considering the future rental income of the next property that they buy. So simply by swapping a lower yielding asset, not only have they increased their cash flow position, they actually freed up some borrowing capacity of 750,000. And so what could they do, right? They could actually buy another property, maybe a home and income that has 1,100 for 1.3 million. You know, this could be something in Manariwa potentially. 1.3, you could potentially achieve 1,100 rent. And so, you know, now let me ask you, right? Like basically you're swapping two of these, like you're swapping a unit like this. So basically 2 mil, because we had 2 mil to play with. So we're swapping 2 of these units for, you know, 2 weary properties plus a home and income. So that's the end position. By swapping just one property, you can add a significant amount of leverage and cash flow into the portfolio. So before and after, if we just simplify it, so before the commercial property, the net cash flow for Mr. and Mrs. Lee, after all the expenses, is around 47,000. With interest rate going up, it's probably less now because interest rate's gone up by like about 0.3% on average. But after the commercial, they could actually add more cash flow. You know, by just doing that swap, they've got 105,000, and that's not even including the new potential property that they may buy of 1.3 million. If they could buy a net cash, like a net positive cash flow property, they could potentially add more passive income into their portfolio. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of how you could utilize commercial property in your portfolio, because the result is higher leverage, higher cash flow. Okay. If you want to learn exactly how you can set up your next 3 property purchase, do check out the Stage 2 Masterclass in the description below. Until the next video, I'll see you again.